Let's return to Brexit now. There is, of course, no doubt that this week has been pivotal for the Prime Minister. Some would say it's been a disaster and the final straw, with many feeling that Theresa May has made a mess of it. But can she come back from this week? What does the future hold for Mrs May? Well, with me to discuss this, I'm joined now by the former advisor and Director of Strategy and Chief Speechwriter to Theresa May, Chris Wilkins, and the political consultant, Ed Rennie. A very good morning to you both. It's not the first time during this process that we have described it as a difficult week for the Prime Minister, but this one perhaps stands out as one of the worst. First of all, to you, Chris Wilkins, if I may, someone who's worked very closely with the Prime Minister and advised her in the past. Do you think she can survive it?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's been written off many times in the past. I've probably done it myself, I would think, at points during this process. But I have to say, this week really has been the worst week of all, and I think Wednesday's events were particularly damaging. I think, firstly, the decision on Wednesday morning to really reverse her position and ask only for a short extension to Article 50 under pressure from sort of the right wing of the Conservative Party was damaging to her credibility. And then really the final straw was that statement on Wednesday night, which was, I think, ill-advised in the first place to even do a statement, and then the actual content of it, I think, really sort of laid out why at times she's fallen short in the negotiations. It was very sort of tin-eared and just strategically a bad thing to do. So I have to say, at the end of this week, and given where we are, even though she's been written off before, it does start to feel like maybe that was really the moment when the end game sort of started.
Ed Rennie, would you agree that the time is ticking on Theresa May's tenure as Prime Minister?
Yes. Certainly that looks incredibly likely. I still think that there's a chance for her to leave with dignity, and that is to make sure that Brexit happens, and to make sure it happens either next week or within a few weeks, and that we leave on WTO rules. I was looking at the Briefings for Brexit website the other day. There are these micro deals which are supposedly mythical, and plenty of those are in fact in place. And Liz Truss has come out reportedly, apparently, saying she would prefer to leave without this or any slightly modified withdrawal agreement, so that we don't get into an indeterminable thing where MPs are trying to get a customs union and the single market and Brexit in name only. We actually leave, and then we make a generous offer, particularly to the Irish. I think May particularly failed in that she was invited to speak to the Irish Parliament and she didn't, right near the beginning of this process. But a generous offer to the Irish, and to keep saying to the EU a tariff-free trade deal, and use those old GATT rules which apply in WTO for tariff-free trade to continue while we negotiate a free trade agreement, remembering that Donald Tusk did actually offer that. So it is still salvageable for May, as one who's typically on the left and opposes the Tories. It's salvageable for her reputation if she delivers Brexit and she holds out against these attempts, these final attempts to scupper it.
Salvageable if she delivers Brexit, but how likely is that? I mean, some questions about whether MV3, the meaningful vote ×3, is even likely to happen if she can't muster the support for it.
Well, I would say that MV3 isn't really Brexit. It's a withdrawal treaty that we'd be tied into, that, unlike the EU, doesn't even have an Article 50 type clause in it, so we could never get out. So we would be stuck in a situation where we would have sort of one-quarter Brexit, and the things that we got back control of would be substituted for the EU having much, much more control of everything else, particularly our trade policy. So the notion that if this withdrawal treaty is agreed by Parliament, then we're basically stuck in it in perpetuity until the EU offers us something else and we agree to something else, which would inevitably be as bad or worse. So, I mean, I think our fishing communities would be absolutely stuffed if this withdrawal treaty passes. And in fact, if we don't leave either March 28th or April 12th, then the fishing communities in particular, who it's absolutely vital for them that we leave the EU, they would be totally scuppered.
Chris Wilkins, it is the only deal that is on the table. So what's your position on whether you think MV3 is likely to go ahead? She is looking excruciatingly isolated now. Some of those MPs that she needed to get behind her feeling exercised after that speech that you were describing on Wednesday this week.
Yes, I think that's right. I think until Wednesday evening, it felt very much around Westminster like things were moving slowly in favour of the withdrawal agreement that's been negotiated, and I think there was optimism that actually, with a third vote now in this coming week, that actually, reluctantly perhaps, but nonetheless, MPs would get behind it and have the chance of passing. I think after Wednesday evening, I think that is now unlikely, and I think people on both sides of the argument are now unlikely to support that deal. So that leaves us in a difficult situation. I think, in that point, then the Prime Minister has a decision to make whether she goes ahead with no deal. But I don't believe Parliament will allow that to happen. I don't think the Speaker will allow it to happen. I think Parliament will find a way to take control. So we might well be looking at a more lengthy delay to the Article 50 process while we rethink the whole thing. The only other thing I'd say, though, is that the argument that the withdrawal agreement is not Brexit is a remarkable thing. Well, here we are a week from when we were supposed to leave, still arguing about what Brexit is supposed to mean. And really what that points to is the fact that actually Brexit was almost entirely unnegotiable from the start, because nobody, even on the Leave side of the argument, can agree on what it actually is. The Leave campaign used to say they were happy with staying in the single market and the customs union, and now this withdrawal agreement, which certainly doesn't do those things, is denounced as not being good enough. So really the problems here were built in from the very start of the process.
And Ed Rennie, that's the problem, isn't it? That the Prime Minister has to try and square a circle. And, we're looking at a divided cabinet, a divided parliament, a divided country, even divided families. I mean, could another Prime Minister, or indeed another leader, have got a different result?
I have to completely disagree with what Chris has just said. It's quite clear that the absolute minimum, if you want to deliver leaving the EU, would be to rejoin EFTA. That would have been a good compromise, and it's perfectly practical. There are some issues, but that would be the minimum. But you need either EFTA at a minimum or leaving on WTO terms. And anything between those 2 points, I think the majority of Brexiteers would absolutely agree is Brexit, with most favouring a comprehensive free trade deal a la Japan or Canada with the EU.
OK, I mean, I do want to focus particularly on the Prime Minister, because we've talked a lot and we continue to talk on Sky News about the ongoing sort of debate about the shape and form of Brexit. But do you think that the Prime Minister, and this question goes to both of you, was the right person to see us through? And is she the right person to finish the job in terms of Brexit?
I think she was the wrong person because she was a Remainer, but also she made that grievous error of calling a general election when disposable incomes were falling and making that general election campaign last about 7 weeks. So she didn't have it on the same day as the local elections, and also people's disposable income was falling, so there was no economic feel-good factor to speak of. It's easy to say that in retrospect, but actually I think if there'd been a proper political analysis and economic analysis of the situation, she wouldn't have called that general election, and she would have been in a much stronger position than she is now. But I still think her biggest failure was not making a big political offer to the Irish, going and speaking to their parliament, because if you look at the Irish border issue, it's not actually about the technicalities. The head of customs in Ireland and in the UK have said that's not really the issue. It was a major political issue, and making a big generous offer to the Irish early on in the process, not calling that general election. And she would have been able to do it, but things did not play out that way, and she showed that she had poor judgment.
OK, finally, same question to you, Chris Wilkins. Who could have done a better job than the Prime Minister?
But I'm not sure who might have done a better job. I'm not sure it's fair to say that just because she voted Remain, she wasn't able to negotiate this. As I say, I think some of the problems with Brexit are really structural. The fact that the Leave campaign didn't put a plan on the table, so nobody really knew what they were voting for, and nobody knew really from the outset what would be acceptable. But to Ed's point, I obviously was one of the people who argued in favour of the general election. I still think it was the right thing to do, but I would agree that not holding it on the day of the local elections and everything was a problem. That was the original plan. But it was really what happened after that election. And it was, I think, very difficult after that election results to look at that and think, well, the right response to this is to continue to pursue an incredibly sort of hard-line Brexit. So that was not what people were voting for in the general election. So after the election, that was the right time to reach out across the aisle and try and find a compromise in Parliament. And I think that, for me, the failure to do that was really ultimately the big mistake, and that means we are where we are.
OK, Chris Wilkins, Ed Rennie, good to talk to you both. Thanks very much indeed.